I walked into my wife's estate settlement, cameras flashing under pitying stares, expecting to be left penniless, until the judge asked one question that made my son freeze, my daughter-in-law's smirk die, and their lawyer turn paper white on the spot, revealing what she hid for 8 years. I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from so I can see how far my story has reached. My name is Vincent, and I thought I knew what betrayal felt like until I walked into that lawyer's office 3 months after burying my wife of 30 years. The mahogany-paneled conference room smelled of old leather and bitter coffee. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting harsh shadows across the polished table where my life was about to be dissected. I arrived 10 minutes early, as I always did, a habit Margaret used to tease me about. "Vincent, you'd be early to your own funeral," she'd laugh, her eyes crinkling at the corners. Now she was gone, and I was facing something that felt remarkably similar to a funeral. My own. Stanley was already there when I walked in, sitting ramrod straight in one of those expensive leather chairs that probably cost more than my monthly pension. My son, the boy I'd raised since he was 5 years old, whose scraped knees I'd bandaged, whose baseball games I'd never missed, barely glanced up when I entered. Next to him sat Leah, my daughter-in-law, her manicured fingers drumming against her designer handbag. That bag probably cost $800. I knew because I'd overheard her bragging about it at Margaret's funeral reception. "Dad," Stanley said, his voice flat and businesslike. No warmth, no acknowledgement of the hell we'd all been through these past few months. Just that cold professional tone he'd adopted sometime after marrying Leah 5 years ago. "Son," I replied, settling into the chair across from them. The distance felt intentional, like I was the defendant and they were the prosecution, which, as it turned out, wasn't far from the truth. Leah finally looked up, offering me one of her practiced smiles, the kind she used on store clerks when she wanted a discount. "Vincent, you look tired. Have you been taking care of yourself?" Her concern felt as genuine as a $3 bill. Before I could answer, the door opened and in walked James Morrison, Esquire. I'd known Jim since high school, back when he was Jimmy Morrison, and spent his afternoons fixing cars instead of fixing legal problems. He'd handled Margaret's and my wills years ago, helped us with the mortgage paperwork when we bought the house on Maple Street. Today, though, he looked uncomfortable, avoiding my eyes as he arranged his papers. "Vincent, thank you for coming," Jim said, still not meeting my gaze. "I know this is difficult timing, but we need to address Margaret's estate." I nodded, my throat tight. Everything about this felt wrong. The formal atmosphere, the way Stanley and Leah sat together like a united front, the way Jim kept shuffling papers instead of looking at me. Margaret and I had discussed our wills openly. Everything was supposed to be straightforward. The house, our savings, everything split between Stanley and me, with a few small bequests to charity. "Before we begin," Jim continued, his voice strangely strained, "I should mention that Mrs. Leah Morrison," I noticed he didn't call her my daughter-in-law, "has retained her own legal counsel for this proceeding." My stomach dropped. Legal counsel? Why would she need— "Dad," Stanley interrupted, "we just want to make sure everything goes smoothly." That's when I noticed the third man in the room, someone I hadn't seen when I walked in. He was younger than Jim, maybe 40, with silver-rimmed glasses and a shark's smile. He introduced himself as David Chen, attorney at law, and everything about him screamed expensive. "Mr. Morrison," Chen said, addressing Jim, "shall we proceed with the reading?" Jim cleared his throat and opened a manila folder. "This is the last will and testament of Margaret Ann Morrison, dated March 15th, 2023. March 15th. I felt a chill run down my spine. That was just 2 weeks after Margaret's surgery, when she was still groggy from the anesthesia and pain medications. I remembered that period clearly. She'd been confused, sometimes forgetting conversations we'd had just hours before. "I'll skip to the relevant portions," Jim continued, his voice growing smaller. "To my beloved son Stanley Morrison and his wife Leah Morrison, I leave my house at 407 Maple Street, including all contents and furnishings, free and clear of any encumbrances." The words hit me like a physical blow. The house, our house, where Margaret and I had spent 30 years building a life together. The house where I'd replaced every light fixture, painted every room, built the back porch with my own hands because Margaret wanted a place to watch the sunrise with her morning coffee. "There must be some mistake," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Margaret and I discussed this. The house was supposed to—" "Dad, please let him finish," Stanley said, but there was something in his tone that made my blood run cold. Not surprise at the revelation, but irritation at my interruption. Jim continued reading, his voice monotone, professional. "To my husband, Vincent Morrison, I leave my personal effects, specifically my jewelry and clothing, to distribute as he sees fit. Personal effects, jewelry and clothing, 30 years of marriage, and I was getting her jewelry and clothing. What about the savings accounts?" I asked, my hands trembling slightly. "The certificates of deposit? Margaret's life insurance?" Chen leaned forward, that shark smile widening. "Mr. Morrison, if you'll allow the reading to continue, all will be explained." Jim's face had gone pale. "The remaining estate, including all financial assets, bank accounts, and investments, totaling approximately $215,000, is to be divided equally between Stanley Morrison and the Riverside Animal Shelter." The silence in the room was deafening. I stared at Jim, waiting for him to say something else, to explain that this was all some terrible mistake, but he just sat there, looking anywhere but at me. "I don't understand," I said, my voice cracking. "Margaret would never— We discussed everything. She promised me that—" "Dad," Stanley said, and for the first time since I'd walked into that room, he actually looked at me. What I saw in his eyes wasn't grief or confusion. It was something much worse. It was pity. Mom was very clear about her wishes. Leah reached over and placed her hand on Stanley's arm, a gesture that looked supportive but felt possessive. "We know this is hard for you, Vincent, but Margaret was worried about your ability to manage such a large inheritance on your own." My ability to manage. I'd managed our household finances for 30 years. I'd worked 2 jobs to pay for Stanley's college education while Margaret battled her first bout with cancer. I'd managed to keep our family afloat through every crisis, every hardship, every challenge life threw at us. "Where did this will come from?" I asked Jim directly. "When did Margaret change the original will?" Jim shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Mrs. Morrison came to my office on March 15th and requested the changes. She was quite insistent." "March 15th, I repeated. "That was 2 weeks after her surgery. She was barely coherent. She couldn't remember our neighbor's name, couldn't remember what she'd had for breakfast. How could she possibly have made such important legal decisions?" Chen intervened smoothly. "Mr. Morrison, I understand your distress, but Mrs. Morrison's mental faculties were evaluated by a qualified physician before any changes were made to her will. She was deemed fully competent to make these decisions." "What physician?" I demanded. Dr. Roberts never mentioned any cognitive evaluation. "A private consultation," Chen replied vaguely. "The documentation is all in order." I felt like I was drowning. Everything I'd thought I knew about my life, my marriage, my family was crumbling around me. The house where I'd planned to live out my remaining years, the financial security Margaret and I had built together, even my relationship with my own son, all of it was slipping away. "I want to see the will," I said, my voice stronger now, fueled by growing anger. "I want to see Margaret's signature." Jim hesitated, then slid a document across the table. I picked it up with hands that shook despite my efforts to control them. There it was, Margaret's signature at the bottom of the page. But something about it looked wrong. The loops were too wide, the slant too pronounced. Margaret had beautiful penmanship, precise and careful. This signature looked hurried, almost shaky. "This doesn't look like Margaret's normal signature," I said, looking up at Jim. "People's handwriting can change when they're under stress or medication," Chen said dismissively. "It's quite common." Stanley cleared his throat. "Dad, I know this is difficult, but fighting this won't bring Mom back. She made her decision. We need to respect that." I stared at my son, This man I'd raised, this boy who used to crawl into bed between Margaret and me during thunderstorms. When had he become so cold? When had he started looking at me like I was a problem to be solved rather than his father? "You knew," I said quietly. "You both knew about this before today." Leah's perfectly manicured fingers tightened around her handbag. Margaret discussed her concerns with us, yes. She wanted us to be prepared. Her concerns about what? Stanley and Leah exchanged a look, one of those wordless communications that married couples develop, but this wasn't the comfortable communication Margaret and I had shared. This was calculating, strategic. "Dad, you have to understand," Stanley said. "Mom was worried about you. After she got sick, you became so dependent on her for everything. She was afraid that if something happened to her, you wouldn't be able to take care of yourself." The words stung because there was a grain of truth in them. Margaret had handled our social calendar, our meal planning, much of our day-to-day organization, but that wasn't dependency, that was partnership. That was 30 years of two people learning how to move through the world together. "So she decided to leave me with nothing?" I asked. "No security, no home, nothing to show for 30 years of marriage?" "You're not left with nothing," Leah said, her voice taking on that patronizing tone she used when she thought she was being helpful. "You have your pension, your social security, and we're not throwing you out immediately. You can stay in the house for 60 days, Stanley finished. "That should give you time to find an apartment, something more manageable." 60 days. 2 months to pack up 30 years of my life and find somewhere else to live on $1,800 a month. I thought about the back porch I'd built, the garden Margaret and I had planted together, the memories embedded in every corner of that house. Jim was shuffling papers again, clearly eager to end this meeting. "Vincent, I'm sorry, I know this isn't what you expected. If you want to contest the will, you certainly have that right, but it would be expensive," Chen interrupted smoothly, "and time-consuming. And ultimately, given the clear documentation of Mrs. Morrison's wishes and mental competency, likely unsuccessful." I looked around the room at these three people who were systematically dismantling my life. Jim, my old friend, couldn't even meet my eyes. Chen looked like a cat with a bowl of cream, and my son, my own son, sat there with an expression of forced patience, like he was waiting for a tantruming child to calm down. But it was Leah who delivered the final blow. She reached into her designer handbag and pulled out a small jewelry box. Inside was Margaret's wedding ring, the simple gold band I'd saved for 3 months to buy when we were young and broke, and so much in love it hurt. "Margaret wanted you to have this," Leah said, holding out the box. "She said you gave it to her, so it should go back to you." I stared at the ring, my vision blurring. This small piece of gold was all I had left of 30 years of marriage. Everything else, the house, the financial security, the future Margaret and I had planned together, was gone. I took the box with trembling hands and stood up. "I need to think about this." "Of course," Stanley said, and for just a moment I heard something that might have been genuine emotion in his voice. "Dad, this doesn't change anything between us. You're still my father. This is just about Mom's estate." I looked at him for a long moment, memorizing his face. "No, son," I said quietly. "This changes everything." As I walked out of that conference room, past the receptionist who offered me a sympathetic smile, down the elevator that smelled of cleaning solution and broken dreams, I realized that I wasn't just mourning my wife anymore. I was mourning my entire family. The parking garage was dim and echoing. I sat in my truck for 20 minutes, staring at the jewelry box in my hands, before I finally understood what had really happened in that room. This wasn't just about an inheritance. This wasn't about Margaret's final wishes. This was about power. And somehow, without my noticing, I'd lost all of mine. But as I drove home to the house that was no longer mine, I couldn't shake the feeling that something didn't add up. The signature that looked wrong, the timing that felt suspicious, the way Leah and Stanley had been so prepared for my shock. Margaret may have been many things, but cruel wasn't one of them. And if I'd learned anything in 62 years of life, it was that when something feels wrong, it usually is. That night I sat in Margaret's garden until well past midnight. her wedding ring clutched in my palm. The roses she'd planted 15 years ago were blooming despite everything. White Elizabeths, her favorites, glowing like ghosts in the moonlight. I'd built the garden bed for her when her first cancer went into remission, and she'd said it was a symbol of new life, new hope. Now it felt like a monument to everything I was about to lose. I kept replaying the meeting in my head, trying to understand how everything had gone so wrong so quickly. The Margaret I knew, the woman who'd held my hand through my father's funeral, who'd stayed up all night with me when Stanley had pneumonia as a child, who'd looked at me with such love even during her final weeks, that woman wouldn't have left me with nothing. She wouldn't have. But then again, I was beginning to realize how little I actually knew about what had been happening in my own family. The signs had been there for months, maybe years. I just hadn't wanted to see them. It started after Stanley married Leah in 2017. Before that, my son and I had been close. Not in that backslapping, fishing every weekend way some fathers and sons are, but in the quiet way of two men who understood each other. He'd call every Sunday, stop by for dinner at least twice a month, help me with projects around the house. Leah changed that slowly, so gradually I didn't notice until it was already done. At first she was charming. She'd compliment Margaret's cooking, ask about my work at the construction company, even offer to help with dishes after dinner. But there were small things, little comments that felt like pinpricks. Stanley works so hard all week, maybe he needs his weekends to relax instead of coming over here. Or, you know, Vincent, Stanley mentioned he feels guilty that you and Margaret do so much for him. Maybe it's time to let him be more independent. Margaret noticed it too, though she never said anything direct. She'd just get quieter after Leah's visits, more thoughtful. Once, about a year after they married, she said to me, "I think Leah feels like she has to compete with us for Stanley's attention." "That's ridiculous," I'd replied. "We're his parents, she's his wife. There's room for everyone." But Margaret had given me one of those looks, the kind that said she knew something I didn't. "Some people don't see it that way, Vincent. Some people think love is a zero-sum game." I should have paid more attention to that conversation. I should have paid attention to a lot of things, like the way Stanley stopped calling every Sunday. First it was every other Sunday, then once a month, then only on holidays. When I asked him about it, he'd say he was busy with work, or that Leah had plans for them, or that he figured I didn't really need to hear from him so often. "We're not going anywhere, Dad," he'd say when I expressed concern. "We're just living our own lives." But it felt like more than that. It felt like I was being systematically edited out of his life. The real change came when Margaret got sick again in 2019. Her cancer came back with a vengeance, and suddenly our world narrowed to doctor appointments, treatment schedules, and the exhausting routine of fighting for her life. Stanley was supportive, or at least he appeared to be. He'd visit Margaret in the hospital, bring flowers, sit with her during chemo sessions when I had to work. But Leah always had opinions about Margaret's care. "Are you sure Dr. Roberts is the best oncologist?" she'd ask. "My friend's mother went to this specialist in California who had amazing results with experimental treatments." "The treatment center here is one of the best in the state," I'd explain. "Dr. Roberts has been treating cancer for 20 years. "But wouldn't it be worth getting a second opinion? Stanley and I could help research other options." At the time, I thought she was being helpful. Now I wonder if she was planting seeds of doubt, making me question whether I was doing enough for my wife. The experimental treatments Leah found were expensive, not covered by insurance, requiring travel, costing tens of thousands of dollars. Margaret was hesitant, but Leah was persuasive. "If it were my mother, I'd want to try everything," she'd say. "Money shouldn't matter when it comes to saving someone's life." So we tried them. We spent our savings on treatments that promised miracles but delivered nothing except false hope and empty bank accounts. By the time Margaret's condition stabilized enough for her surgery in 2022, we'd spent over $60,000 chasing cures that didn't exist. Margaret was devastated by the financial impact. "Vincent, I'm so sorry," she'd say. "We've spent everything, and for what?" "For you," I'd tell her. "For the chance to have more time together. The money doesn't matter." But it did matter, especially to her. Margaret had always been proud of our financial stability, the way we'd built something together from nothing. Losing our savings to chase false promises broke something in her that went deeper than the cancer. The surgery, in February of 2022, was supposed to be routine, removing some scar tissue that was causing problems. But something went wrong with the anesthesia, and Margaret came out of it confused and disoriented. For weeks afterward, she struggled with memory issues, forgetting conversations, losing track of time, sometimes not recognizing me at first when she woke up. Dr. Roberts assured us it was temporary, a side effect of the medications and the stress her body had been under. "Give it time," he said. "The brain needs time to heal." During that period, Leah was constantly around. She'd bring soup, help with Margaret's medications, stay with her when I had to run errands. I was grateful for the help, especially since I was exhausted from months of being the primary caregiver. "You look terrible, Vincent," Leah would say. "When's the last time you had a full night's sleep? Let me stay with Margaret tonight. You need to take care of yourself too." It was during one of those nights in March that Margaret apparently went to see Jim Morrison about changing her will. I know because I found the appointment card in her purse weeks later, tucked behind her insurance cards. March 15th, 2:30 p.m., Morrison Law Office. I confronted her about it when I found the card. This was in April, when she was feeling better, more like herself again. "Margaret, what's this appointment card? Did you go see Jim about something?" She stared at the card for a long moment, her brow furrowed in concentration. "I don't remember going to see Jim," she said finally. "Was I supposed to?" "This card is from March 15th. It has your name on it." She shook her head slowly. "March is still fuzzy for me, Vincent. I don't remember a lot from that time. Maybe I made the appointment and forgot to go." But the appointment had been kept. Someone had signed my name in Jim's appointment book that day. Someone who looked enough like Margaret to fool a receptionist, but who wasn't quite Margaret. I should have investigated further. I should have called Jim, asked questions, demanded answers. But Margaret was getting stronger every day, and I was focused on her recovery, not on mysterious appointments she couldn't remember. Now I wished I'd paid attention. Now I wished I'd questioned everything. Sitting in the garden that night after the will reading, I forced myself to remember other things I'd overlooked. Like how Stanley had started asking detailed questions about our finances during Margaret's illness. "Dad, do you and Mom have everything organized? Wills, insurance papers, bank account information?" "Of course we do. Jim Morrison handled all of that years ago." "But have you updated anything recently? With Mom being sick, maybe you should review everything, make sure it's all current." "Why would we need to change anything?" Stanley would shrug, as if it were just a casual suggestion. "I don't know. People's priorities change. Maybe Mom has thoughts about how she wants things handled." Leah would nod along. "My grandmother changed her will 3 times in her final years. She wanted to make sure everything reflected her current wishes." These conversations always felt natural at the time, like they were just being thoughtful about our family's future, but now they felt calculated, like they were fishing for information. There were other things too. The way Leah had started organizing Margaret's medications, insisting it would be easier if everything was in one place. The way she'd volunteered to drive Margaret to appointments, even when I was available. The way she'd started answering Margaret's phone sometimes when Margaret was resting. "Oh, Vincent's not here right now," I'd heard her say once when I was actually in the next room. "Can I take a message?" When I asked her about it later, she'd laughed it off. "Margaret was sleeping and you were in the shower. I was just trying to help." But it felt like more than help. It felt like control. The most troubling memory came back to me as I sat there in the cold garden air. It was from Margaret's final week when she was in hospice, care at home. She'd been drifting in and out of consciousness, but during one of her lucid moments, she'd grabbed my hand with surprising strength. "Vincent," she'd whispered, "I need to tell you something important." "What is it, sweetheart?" "About the money, about what Leah said, I don't remember." But before she could finish, Leah had walked into the room with a cup of tea. "Margaret, you should rest." she'd said gently. Save your energy. Margaret had looked frustrated, like she was trying to hold on to a thought that was slipping away. There was something about papers, she'd said, something I was supposed to sign. Leah had sat down on the edge of the bed, her voice soothing. You don't need to worry about papers now. Everything's taken care of. Margaret had closed her eyes, and when she opened them again, that moment of clarity was gone. She never brought it up again. At the time, I'd thought Leah was being kind, helping Margaret not to worry about practical matters during her final days. Now I wondered what Margaret had been trying to tell me. As dawn broke over the garden, I made a decision. I wasn't going to accept what had happened in that conference room. I wasn't going to quietly pack up my life and disappear into some small apartment to live out my remaining years in poverty and isolation. Margaret hadn't betrayed me. I was as certain of that as I was of my own name, which meant someone else had, and I was going to find out who. I picked up my phone and dialed a number I'd found online the night before. Henderson Investigations, a voice answered. How can I help you? I need help proving my wife's will was forged, I said, my voice steadier than it had been in months. And I think I know who did it. The sun was fully up now, warming the garden where Margaret's roses bloomed in defiant beauty. I touched one of the white petals, thinking about new life, new hope, new possibilities. I wasn't going to let them win, not without a fight. But as I walked back toward the house that was no longer mine, I had no idea how much darker this story was about to become. 2 weeks later, I found myself sitting in Judge Patricia Hamilton's courtroom, my hands folded tightly in my lap to keep them from shaking. The marble floors echoed with footsteps, and afternoon sunlight streamed through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the polished wooden benches. Despite the grandeur of the setting, I felt small and out of place. Henderson Investigations had done good work. Tom Henderson, a former police detective with 30 years of experience, had spent those 2 weeks digging into every detail of Margaret's final months. What he'd found was enough to raise serious questions about the will's authenticity. But as my own lawyer, Sarah Chen, no relation to Stanley's shark, had warned me, proving forgery in court was a different matter entirely. Vincent, she'd said during our final preparation meeting, we have enough to create reasonable doubt, but David Chen is going to fight this every step of the way. He's got a reputation for being ruthless, and he's already filed motions to dismiss based on the time limits for contesting wills. I looked across the courtroom to where Stanley and Leah sat with their legal team. My son wore his best suit, the navy blue one Margaret had bought him for his wedding. Leah was dressed conservatively, her usual flashy, jewelry replaced with simple pearl earrings and a modest watch. They looked like the grieving family, while I probably looked like the bitter old man trying to steal from his own son. The irony wasn't lost on me. Judge Hamilton was in her 60s, with silver hair pulled back in a neat bun and reading glasses that she kept adjusting as she reviewed the papers in front of her. She had a reputation for fairness, but also for impatience with frivolous lawsuits. Sarah had warned me that we'd have one chance to present our case before the judge decided whether to throw it out entirely. All rise, the bailiff called, and we stood as Judge Hamilton took her seat. This is the matter of Morrison versus Morrison, she said, her voice carrying easily through the courtroom. We're here to address a petition to contest the will of Margaret Ann Morrison, deceased. Mr. Chen, you're representing the beneficiaries? David Chen stood smoothly, his expensive suit and confident demeanor radiating competence. Yes, Your Honor. We're here on behalf of Stanley Morrison and Leah Morrison, the primary beneficiaries of the deceased's will. We believe this contest is without merit and ask that it be dismissed. Ms. Chen, Judge Hamilton said, turning to my lawyer, you're representing the contestant? Sarah stood, her posture straight but not arrogant. Yes, Your Honor. We represent Vincent Morrison, the deceased's husband of 30 years, who believes the will in question is not authentic. Judge Hamilton nodded and put on her reading glasses. I've reviewed the preliminary motions. Mr. David Chen, Your clients are asking for dismissal based on the statute of limitations. That's correct, Your Honor. Texas law requires will contests to be filed within 2 years of the will being admitted to probate, but more importantly, within 90 days of receiving notice of the will's contents. Mr. Morrison was present at the reading on April 8th and didn't file this contest until 23 days later, well beyond the reasonable time frame for such actions. I felt my heart sink. Sarah had explained this hurdle to me, but hearing it in court made it feel insurmountable. Sarah stood again. Your Honor, while the contest was filed 23 days after the will reading, there are exceptional circumstances that justify the delay. Mr. Morrison is alleging fraud, which under Texas law extends the time limits for contesting a will. Additionally, evidence of the alleged forgery only came to light through investigation that began after the will reading. What evidence? Judge Hamilton asked, her tone neutral but interested. Sarah glanced at me and I gave her a small nod. Your Honor, we have a handwriting analysis that suggests the signature on the will is not consistent with the deceased's normal handwriting. Additionally, we have evidence that Mrs. Morrison was heavily medicated and experiencing cognitive difficulties at the time the will was allegedly signed. David Chen was on his feet immediately. Objection, Your Honor. Any handwriting analysis would need to be conducted by a court-approved expert, and the medical records clearly show that Mrs. Morrison was competent when she signed the will. Mr. Chen, Judge Hamilton said, this isn't a trial yet. I'm trying to determine whether there's enough evidence to proceed. She turned back to Sarah. Ms. Chen, you mentioned cognitive difficulties. Do you have medical documentation? We do, Your Honor. Dr. Roberts, Mrs. Morrison's oncologist, has provided records showing that she experienced significant disorientation and memory loss following her surgery in February of 2022. The will was allegedly signed on March 15th during this period of documented cognitive impairment. I watched David Chen's face carefully. For just a moment I saw something flicker across his expression, not quite panic, but definitely concern. Judge Hamilton was quiet for a moment, studying the papers in front of her. Then she looked up, her gaze moving between the two legal teams. I'm going to allow limited discovery on this matter. However, before we proceed, I have some questions about the circumstances surrounding this will. She pulled out a different set of papers, the original will that Margaret and I had signed years earlier, and the new will that had disinherited me. Mr. David Chen, your clients are alleging that Mrs. Morrison came to Mr. Morrison's office. She nodded toward Jim Morrison, who was sitting in the gallery looking thoroughly uncomfortable, on March 15th and requested these specific changes to her will. That's correct, Your Honor. And she was accompanied by someone that day? David Chen hesitated. I noticed he glanced quickly at Leah before answering. I believe she was accompanied by her daughter-in-law who helped her with transportation due to her recent surgery. Judge Hamilton nodded slowly. I see. And Mr. Morrison, she was addressing Jim now, you witnessed Mrs. Morrison's signature on this will? Jim stood up slowly. He looked like he'd aged 10 years since Margaret's funeral. Yes, Your Honor. How long have you known Mrs. Morrison? About 25 years, Your Honor. I've been the family's attorney for most of their marriage. And in your professional opinion, did she seem competent to make these legal decisions on March 15th? Jim was quiet for a long moment. Too long. She seemed determined, Your Honor. That's not what I asked, Mr. Morrison. Did she seem competent? Another pause. She was accompanied by her daughter-in-law who helped explain some of the changes she wanted to make. Judge Hamilton's expression sharpened. Mr. Morrison, I need a direct answer. In your professional opinion, was Margaret Morrison mentally competent to make these legal decisions on March 15th, 2023? The courtroom was completely silent. I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears. Jim looked across the room at me, and for just a moment I saw the man I'd known for 40 years, not the lawyer, not the professional, but Jimmy Morrison, who used to help me work on cars behind his father's garage. Your Honor, he said quietly, I had concerns about her mental state that day. David Chen shot to his feet. Objection! Mr. Morrison is not qualified to make medical determinations about— Overruled, Judge Hamilton said sharply. Mr. Morrison, please continue. Jim took a deep breath. Mrs. Morrison seemed confused about some basic facts. She couldn't remember our previous conversations about her estate planning. At one point, she asked me why Vincent, her husband, wouldn't inherit the house they'd shared for 30 years. When I explained that was what she was requesting, she seemed surprised. I felt tears prick my eyes. That sounded like the Margaret I knew. But she signed the will anyway? Judge Hamilton asked. Her daughter-in-law explained to her that this was what she wanted, that they had discussed it extensively. Mrs. Morrison seemed to defer to her judgment. Judge Hamilton was quiet for a long moment, studying the signatures on both wills. Then she asked the question that changed everything. Mr. Morrison, you said Mrs. Morrison's daughter-in-law helped explain the changes. Was the daughter-in-law present when Mrs. Morrison actually signed the document? Yes, Your Honor. In the same room? Yes, Your Honor. Where exactly was she standing? Jim hesitated, and I saw David Chen tense up beside his clients. She was standing directly behind Mrs. Morrison's chair. And where were you? I was across the desk, Your Honor. Judge Hamilton leaned forward. So the daughter-in-law had a clear view of the signature as it was being written. Yes, Your Honor. And access to Mrs. Morrison's hand as she signed? The implications of the question hung in the air like smoke. I saw Leah go pale, saw Stanley turn to look at his wife with a confused expression. Your Honor, David Chen said, I object to this line of questioning. There's no evidence of any impropriety. Mr. Chen, Judge Hamilton interrupted, I'm trying to establish the circumstances under which this will was signed. Mr. Morrison, please answer the question. Jim nodded slowly. Yes, Your Honor. Mrs. Morrison's daughter-in-law was positioned where she could have guided her hand during the signature. The silence in the courtroom was deafening. I looked at Stanley, saw the confusion in his eyes turn to something else, suspicion, maybe even horror. Judge Hamilton removed her glasses and cleaned them carefully. Given the testimony we've heard today about Mrs. Morrison's cognitive state, the unusual circumstances of the will signing, and the significant deviation from the original estate plan, I'm going to allow this contest to proceed to trial. David Chen was on his feet again. Your Honor, we respectfully request— Request denied, Judge Hamilton said firmly. Furthermore, I'm ordering the preservation of all documents related to this estate, including any financial records, medical records, and correspondence between the parties. Nothing is to be destroyed or altered pending the outcome of this trial. She looked directly at Leah as she said this last part, and I saw my daughter-in-law's face go even paler. Trial will commence in 30 days. Judge Hamilton continued. Both parties will have access to full discovery, including the right to depose all relevant witnesses. Court is adjourned. As the judge left the bench, I sat there stunned. We'd not only survived the motion to dismiss, we'd gotten a trial date, and, more importantly, we'd gotten Jim to admit his concerns about Margaret's mental state that day. But as I watched Stanley turn to Leah with a look of growing suspicion, I realized that the judge's questions had accomplished something else entirely. They'd planted a seed of doubt in my son's mind about his own wife. Sarah gathered her papers and leaned over to me. That went better than I hoped, she whispered. But Vincent, you need to prepare yourself. If Leah really did forge that signature, she's going to fight like hell to keep that from coming out, and that could get dangerous. I looked across the courtroom, where Stanley was having what appeared to be a heated, whispered conversation with Leah. Her face was flushed, her hands gesturing rapidly as she spoke. Stanley's expression was growing darker by the moment. As we filed out of the courtroom, I heard Leah's voice rising slightly. Stanley, you can't possibly believe— I don't know what to believe anymore, my son replied, his voice tight with anger and confusion. Walking down the courthouse steps into the afternoon sunshine, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. hope. But I also felt something else, a growing certainty that the real truth about Margaret's death was much worse than I'd imagined, and that Leah Morrison was more dangerous than any of us had realized. The call came at 6:30 in the morning, 3 days after the court hearing. I was sitting at my kitchen table drinking coffee and staring at the stack of financial documents Sarah had asked me to gather for discovery when my phone rang. "Vincent, it's Tom Henderson. You need to get down to my office right away." There was something in the investigator's voice that made my stomach clench. "What did you find?" "Not over the phone. How soon can you be here?" 30 minutes later, I was sitting across from Tom in his cramped office above a Chinese restaurant on 5th Street. The smell of sesame oil and soy sauce drifted up through the floorboards, mixing with the scent of old coffee and cigarettes. Tom looked like he hadn't slept. His usually neat desk covered with documents, photographs, and what looked like bank statements. "Vincent," he said, pouring himself another cup of coffee with hands that weren't quite steady. "I've been doing this for 30 years and I've never seen anything quite like this." He spread out a series of documents in front of me. "Remember how you told me about those expensive treatments Leah suggested for Margaret? The ones that cost you over $60,000? I nodded, my throat tight. "What about them?" "Well, I did some digging into the medical billing for those treatments." He pointed to a bank statement. "Look at this deposit into Leah's personal checking account, March 22, 2022, $22,000. I stared at the numbers, not understanding. "What does this have to do with—" "Vincent, that money came from the account for Advanced Cancer Solutions, one of the treatment centers Leah recommended for Margaret." The words didn't make sense at first. I read the bank statement again, trying to process what Tom was telling me. "Are you saying—" "I'm saying Leah Morrison was getting kickbacks from the treatment centers she recommended. Every time she sent a patient there, she got a percentage of what the family paid." The coffee in my stomach turned to acid. "She was making money from Margaret's cancer?" Tom nodded grimly. "But that's not the worst part." He pulled out another set of documents. "I tracked down the handwriting expert your lawyer wanted. Dr. Elizabeth Ward, she's one of the best in the country. She compared the signature on Margaret's will to samples of her authentic handwriting from bank documents, medical forms, Christmas cards." He slid a report across the desk. "Vincent, that signature on the will? It's not just inconsistent with Margaret's normal handwriting, it's a traced forgery." I felt like I was falling. "Traced?" "Someone took an authentic signature of Margaret's and traced over it, trying to make it look natural. Dr. Ward can tell because of the pressure patterns, the hesitation marks. When someone traces a signature, they have to go slowly, and that shows up in the line quality." Tom pulled out a magnified photograph of the will's signature. "See these spots where the ink is heavier? Those are pause points where whoever was doing the tracing stopped to check their work. Margaret's real signatures flow naturally. This one doesn't." I stared at the photograph, seeing the evidence of deception laid out in black ink. Someone had sat down with Margaret's real signature and carefully traced over it, forging her final wishes. "But that's still not the worst part," Tom continued. I looked up at him, not sure how much more I could take. "What else?" He pulled out a thick folder. "I've been going through Margaret's medical records, trying to establish a timeline of her cognitive issues. I found something that doesn't make sense." Tom opened the folder and spread out medical bills, prescription records, and appointment schedules. According to her oncology records, Margaret was supposed to receive a specific combination of pain medications after her surgery. But look at these pharmacy records. He pointed to a list of prescriptions filled during Margaret's recovery period. She was getting twice the recommended dose of some medications and medications that weren't even prescribed by Dr. Roberts. I don't understand. How is that possible? Someone was filling additional prescriptions at different pharmacies, using Margaret's insurance information but not going through her primary physician. Tom's expression was grim. "Vincent, I think Margaret was being deliberately over-medicated during the period when that will was signed." The room seemed to spin around me. "You're saying someone was drugging my wife?" "I'm saying someone was making sure she was too confused to understand what she was signing, and I think I know who." Tom pulled out one more document, a prescription record from a pharmacy across town. This prescription for additional pain medication was picked up on March 14th, the day before Margaret allegedly went to see the lawyer. It was filled by someone using Margaret's insurance card, but it wasn't Margaret who picked it up. How do you know? Because the pharmacy has security cameras, and the person who picked up that prescription was Leah Morrison. I sat back in my chair, my mind reeling. The scope of what Tom was telling me was staggering. Not only had Leah forged Margaret's signature on the will, but she'd been systematically drugging my wife to make her more compliant, more confused, easier to manipulate. "There's more?" Tom said quietly. "I found records of other activities on Leah's bank accounts that don't match her supposed income, deposits from medical equipment companies, pharmaceutical suppliers, even a medical transport service. Vincent, I think Leah's been running some kind of scheme, using sick people to generate money." "How many people?" "I've found evidence of at least 8 other families over the past 4 years, all elderly, all dealing with serious medical conditions, all steered toward expensive treatments that may not have been necessary." I thought about all the times Leah had been so helpful during Margaret's illness, so knowledgeable about treatment options, so eager to research alternatives. I'd thought she was being a caring daughter-in-law. Instead, she'd been turning my wife's suffering into profit. "Does Stanley know?" I asked. Tom shook his head. "I don't think so. From what I can tell, Leah kept this completely separate from her marriage. She even has a separate post office box where all the medical company correspondence goes." "So my son had no idea his wife was running a medical fraud scheme and poisoning his mother?" "No, I don't think he did." I sat there in silence, trying to process the enormity of what I'd learned. Margaret hadn't betrayed me by changing her will. She'd been drugged, confused, and manipulated into signing a forged document. Her own daughter-in-law had been profiting from her illness while pretending to care for her. "What do we do now?" I asked. Tom gathered up the documents. "We turn this over to your lawyer and let her decide how to proceed. But Vincent, you need to understand, this isn't just about contesting a will anymore. This is criminal fraud, possibly attempted murder if we can prove the over-medication was intentional. Leah Morrison is looking at serious prison time if this all comes out." "Good," I said, and I meant it. "But she's not going to go down without a fight. And she's got Stanley convinced that you're the problem, that you're trying to steal his inheritance out of bitterness. When this all comes out, it's going to destroy your son's world." I thought about Stanley, about the way he'd looked at Leah with growing suspicion after the court hearing. Maybe it's time his world was destroyed. Maybe he needs to see what he married. Tom nodded. "I'll call Sarah Chen and set up a meeting. We need to get this information to the authorities as soon as possible." I stood up to leave, then turned back. "Tom, how did you figure all this out? How did you know to look at the pharmacy records?" He smiled grimly. "Because I've seen this before, just not on this scale. My own mother was scammed by someone similar, a woman who befriended elderly cancer patients and then convinced them to try expensive treatments that didn't work. The difference is, that woman just took their money and disappeared. Leah Morrison married into your family and decided to make it a long-term business. How long do you think she's been planning this?" "Since before she married Stanley, I'd guess. She targeted your family specifically, a successful middle-class family with aging parents and substantial assets. Stanley was her way in, but you and Margaret were always the real prizes." I walked out into the morning sunshine feeling like I'd been hit by a truck. Everything I'd thought I knew about my family, about Margaret's final months, about my son's marriage had been a lie. Leah hadn't just stolen my inheritance, she'd stolen Margaret's final months of peace, poisoned her mind with unnecessary medications, and turned her death into a business opportunity. But as I drove home, I realized something else. For the first time since Margaret's death, I felt like I had a clear enemy to fight against. Not grief, not confusion, not the slow erosion of old age and loss. Something concrete, something I could battle. Leah Morrison had made one critical mistake. She'd underestimated the depth of love between a man and the woman he'd spent 30 years building a life with. She'd assumed I would quietly accept my losses and fade away. She was about to learn how wrong she'd been. My phone rang as I pulled into my driveway. It was Stanley. "Dad, we need to talk." His voice sounded different, strained, maybe even scared. "What about, son?" "About Leah, about Mom, about things that aren't adding up." I closed my eyes, feeling a mixture of relief and dread. "What kind of things?" "Can you come over tonight? Leah's at her book club so we can talk privately." "I'll be there at 7. After I hung up, I sat in my truck for a long time, staring at the house that would soon no longer be mine. Tomorrow, Sarah would present Tom's findings to the court. Leah's world would start crumbling, and Stanley would have to face the truth about the woman he'd married. But tonight, for the first time in months, my son wanted to talk to me. And maybe, just maybe, I could start getting my family back, even if it meant destroying everything Stanley thought he knew about his life. Stanley's house looked different when I pulled up that evening. The same suburban colonial with the manicured lawn and expensive landscaping that Leah had insisted on, but somehow it felt smaller, more fragile, like a stage set that might collapse if you looked at it too closely. My son opened the door before I could knock. He looked terrible, hollow-eyed, unshaven, wearing the same clothes he'd had on in court 3 days earlier. This wasn't the polished, successful man who'd sat across from me in that conference room and watched me lose everything. This was someone whose world was cracking apart. "Dad," he said, stepping aside to let me in, "thanks for coming." The living room was a shrine to Leah's expensive taste. White leather furniture that cost more than most people's cars. Abstract art that looked like someone had sneezed paint onto canvas, crystal vases filled with flowers that were replaced twice a week whether they needed it or not. Everything perfect, everything cold. Stanley gestured for me to sit, then began pacing back and forth in front of the fireplace. "I've been thinking about what that lawyer asked in court," he said without preamble, "about Leah being behind Mom when she signed the will." I waited, not trusting myself to speak. "And I've been thinking about other things, too. Things that didn't make sense at the time, but now." He stopped pacing and looked at me directly. "Dad, I need you to tell me the truth. Do you really think Mom would have cut you out of her will?" The question hung between us, like a bridge I was afraid to cross. This was my chance to tell him about Tom's investigation, about the forged signature and the medical fraud. But looking at my son's haunted expression, I realized he was already drowning. Adding more weight might pull him under completely. "No," I said simply. "Your mother loved me until the day she died. She would never have left me with nothing." Stanley's shoulders sagged. "That's what I keep thinking too. Mom wasn't cruel. Even when she was angry with someone, she wasn't cruel." He started pacing again, running his hands through his hair. "But if she didn't really change the will, then—" He trailed off, unable to say it out loud. "Then someone else did," I finished for him. Stanley stopped, pacing, and stared at me. "Do you think Leah—" He couldn't finish the sentence. Before I could answer, we heard the sound of a car in the driveway. Stanley's face went pale. "She's home early." The front door opened and Leah's voice carried through the house. "Stanley? Why is your father's truck in our driveway?" She appeared in the living room doorway, and I watched her expression shift from surprise to anger to something calculating in the space of a heartbeat. She was wearing her book club outfit, designer jeans and a cashmere sweater that probably cost more than my monthly pension, but there was something different about her demeanor, less controlled, more desperate. "Vincent," she said, her voice artificially sweet, "this is a surprise. Stanley didn't mention you were coming over." Stanley was staring at his wife like he was seeing her for the first time. "Book club ended early." "We canceled," Leah said, moving to the bar cart and pouring herself a glass of wine with hands that weren't quite steady. "Helen's husband had a heart attack. We're all very concerned." She took a long sip of wine, her eyes moving between Stanley and me. "So, what brings you here, Vincent? I hope you're not filling Stanley's head with more conspiracy theories about your mother's will." The casualness of it, the way she could stand there and lie while discussing Margaret's final wishes, made my hands clench into fists, but Stanley spoke before I could. "Leah, I need to ask you something, and I need you to tell me the truth." Something flickered across Leah's face. "Of course, honey, what is it?" "Were you in the room when Mom signed her will?" Leah's wineglass paused halfway to her lips. "What kind of question is that?" "A simple one. Were you there when she signed it?" "Stanley, you're scaring me. Why are you asking this?" "Because the lawyer in court said you were standing behind Mom's chair when she signed. He said you could have guided her hand." Leah laughed, but it sounded forced. "That's ridiculous. Your mother was perfectly capable of signing her own name." "Was she?" Stanley's voice was getting stronger, more certain. "Because I remember how confused she was after her surgery. She couldn't remember conversations we'd had the day before. She couldn't remember where she put things, sometimes couldn't remember people's names." "She was fine when it came to important decisions," Leah insisted. "She knew exactly what she wanted." "Did she?" Stanley took a step toward his wife. "Because Dad says Mom was asking about papers she was supposed to sign just before she died. She seemed confused about what she'd agreed to." Leah's face flushed. "Your father is a bitter old man who can't accept that his wife didn't think he was capable of managing money. He's trying to turn you against me because he's angry about losing his inheritance." "My inheritance," Stanley repeated slowly. "That's interesting phrasing." "What do you mean?" "You said his inheritance, like it was something that belonged to him. But if Mom really wanted to leave everything to us, it was never his inheritance to begin with, was it?" I watched Leah realize she'd made a mistake. Her wineglass was trembling now. "Stanley, you're twisting my words. I just meant—" "What I want to know," Stanley continued, his voice gaining momentum, "is how you knew so much about those experimental treatments for Mom. You always seem to have the perfect recommendation, the perfect doctor, the perfect clinic." Leah's eyes darted toward me, then back to Stanley. "I researched everything thoroughly. I wanted what was best for your mother." "You researched everything," Stanley repeated. "For someone who'd never dealt with cancer before, you sure knew a lot of doctors." "I'm good at research." "Are you?" Stanley's voice was getting dangerously quiet. "Because I did some research of my own today, Leah. I looked at our bank statements." The color drained from Leah's face. "Stanley, what are you talking about?" "I'm talking about deposits in your personal account that I can't explain. I'm talking about money coming from medical companies I've never heard of. I'm talking about a separate post office box that you never told me about." Leah set down her wineglass with a shaking hand. "I can explain all of that." "Then explain." For a long moment, Leah stood frozen, her mouth opening and closing like she was trying to find words that wouldn't come. Finally, she seemed to make a decision. "Fine," she said, her voice turning hard. "You want the truth? The truth is that your precious mother was bleeding you dry with her medical expenses. The truth is that someone had to make practical decisions while you were drowning in guilt and your father was throwing money at useless treatments." Stanley stared at her. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying I found ways to recoup some of the costs. The medical companies pay referral fees to people who recommend patients. I was making sure we didn't go bankrupt caring for someone who was going to die anyway." The silence in the room was deafening. I felt sick to my stomach, but also strangely relieved. Leah was finally showing her true face. Stanley's voice, when he spoke, was barely a whisper. "You were making money from my mother's cancer." "I was protecting our financial future," Leah snapped. "Someone had to think practically. You were so busy being the devoted son, and your father was so busy playing the martyr husband, that neither of you was thinking about what this was costing. So you decided to profit from her suffering. I decided to make the best of a terrible situation." Stanley turned away from his wife and looked at me. "Dad, is there more?" This was the moment of truth. I could keep Tom's discoveries to myself, let Stanley figure it out gradually, or I could tell him everything and watch his marriage explode completely. Looking at my son's face, seeing the pain and Betrayal already there, I made my choice. Yes, I said quietly. There's a lot more. I told him about the forged signature, about the extra medications, about the pattern of elderly victims. With each revelation, Stanley seemed to shrink, while Leah grew more defiant. You can't prove any of that, she said when I finished. Actually, we can, I replied. The handwriting expert, the pharmacy records, the bank statements, it's all documented. Leah's facade finally cracked completely. You bastard, she snarled. You couldn't just accept what happened and move on. You had to dig and dig until you ruined everything. I ruined everything? I stood up, my own anger finally breaking free. You forged my wife's signature. You drugged her to make her compliant. You turned her illness into a business opportunity, and you want to blame me for ruining things? She was going to die anyway, Leah screamed. The extra medications didn't kill her, the cancer did. I just made sure her death served a purpose instead of being completely pointless. The words hung in the air like poison gas. Stanley was staring at his wife with an expression of complete horror. Get out, he said quietly. Stanley, get out! He was shouting now, his face red with rage. Get out of this house right now. Leah looked between Stanley and me, her expression calculating even in defeat. If I leave, I'm taking half of everything with me. The house, the savings, all of it. Take it, Stanley said. I don't want anything you've touched. Leah's mouth twisted into something ugly. You'll regret this, Stanley. Both of you will regret this. You have no idea what I'm capable of. Actually, I said, I think we're starting to get a pretty good idea. Leah grabbed her purse and headed for the door, then turned back one last time. Your precious Margaret wasn't the saint you think she was, Vincent. She knew exactly what she was signing. She was just too much of a coward to tell you herself that she thought you were a failure as a husband. Before I could stop him, Stanley lunged toward Leah. Don't you dare talk about my mother like that. Leah flinched but didn't back down. The truth hurts, doesn't it? She told me she was tired of taking care of a man who couldn't take care of himself. You're lying, Stanley said, but his voice was shaking. Am I? Ask your father how many nights she cried herself to sleep worrying about money. Ask him how many times she said she wished she'd married someone who could actually provide for her. I felt like I'd been punched in the stomach, not because I believed her, but because I could see the doubt creeping into Stanley's eyes. Margaret never said any of those things, I said firmly. You're trying to hurt us because you've been caught. Leah smiled coldly. Believe whatever helps you sleep at night, Vincent. But deep down, you know I'm right. You know you failed her. She walked out, slamming the door behind her. Stanley and I stood in the sudden silence, both of us shaken by the confrontation. Finally, my son collapsed into one of Leah's expensive chairs and put his head in his hands. Dad, he said, his voice muffled, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry I believed her. I'm sorry I let her manipulate me against you. I'm sorry I didn't see what she was doing to Mom. I sat down across from him. You couldn't have known. But I should have. I should have paid more attention. I should have questioned why she always knew so much about medical treatments. I should have wondered why she was so eager to help with Mom's care. Leah is very good at manipulation, Stanley. She fooled all of us. Stanley looked up at me with red-rimmed eyes. Do you think what she said about Mom is true? About her regretting marrying you? I thought about Margaret, about 30 years of shared laughter and tears, about the way she'd looked at me even during her final weeks. No, son. Your mother and I weren't perfect, but we loved each other deeply. That's why Leah's lies hurt so much, because they're designed to make us doubt what was real. Stanley nodded slowly. What happens now? Now we make sure she pays for what she did, and we try to rebuild what she tore down. As I drove home that night, I realized that while I'd lost my wife and nearly lost my son, I'd gained something too. The knowledge that Margaret had never betrayed me, had never stopped loving me. But I also knew that Leah's threat hadn't been idle. She was dangerous, cornered, and desperate. And desperate people were capable of almost anything. The war was far from over. 6 weeks later, I stood in Judge Hamilton's courtroom for what I hoped would be the final time. The morning light streaming through the tall windows seemed different now, warmer, less harsh. The marble floors still echoed with footsteps, but the sound no longer filled me with dread. Leah sat at the defendant's table with a new lawyer, her third since the criminal charges had been filed. She looked smaller somehow, diminished by the weight of the evidence against her. Gone were the designer clothes and expensive jewelry. Today she wore a simple gray suit, her hair pulled back severely, her face pale and drawn. Stanley sat beside me in the gallery. We'd spent the past month rebuilding our relationship, talking through years of manipulation and misunderstanding. It hadn't been easy. There were moments when the damage felt too deep to repair, but we were trying. Margaret would have wanted us to try. "All rise," the bailiff called, and Judge Hamilton entered for the final hearing. Sarah Chen had warned me this moment would feel anticlimactic after everything we'd been through. The criminal case against Leah was proceeding separately, with charges of fraud, forgery, and elder abuse that would likely put her in prison for years. Today was just about the will, about getting back what had always been mine. But sitting there, watching Judge Hamilton review the evidence one final time, it felt like everything. It felt like justice for Margaret, vindication for our love, proof that 30 years of marriage hadn't been erased by one woman's greed. "In the matter of Morrison versus Morrison," Judge Hamilton began, "this court has reviewed extensive evidence regarding the authenticity of the will dated March 15, 2023. She paused, looking over her reading glasses at the assembled parties. "The evidence presented shows conclusively that the signature on this will was forged, traced from an authentic signature of the deceased. Furthermore, evidence shows that Mrs. Margaret Morrison was deliberately over-medicated during the period when this will was allegedly signed, rendering her unable to make competent legal decisions." I felt Stanley's hand squeeze my shoulder. "Additionally," the judge continued, "evidence presented during discovery reveals a pattern of financial fraud perpetrated by the defendant, Mrs. Leah Morrison, targeting elderly cancer patients and their families. While these criminal matters are being addressed separately, they speak to motive and character in this civil proceeding." Judge Hamilton removed her glasses and looked directly at me. "Mr. Vincent Morrison, this court finds that the will dated March 15, 2023 is invalid due to forgery and fraud. The previous will, dated June 10, 2015, is hereby reinstated as the valid last will and testament of Margaret Ann Morrison." The words I'd been waiting months to hear. The house was mine. The savings were mine. Margaret's true wishes had been honored. But as I sat there feeling the weight of victory, I realized something had changed in me. The man who'd walked into that lawyer's office months ago, desperate and broken, wasn't the same man sitting in this courtroom today. "Furthermore," Judge Hamilton continued, "this court is ordering full restitution to Mr. Morrison for legal fees and costs associated with this fraudulent contest. Additionally, any assets currently held by Mrs. Leah Morrison that can be traced to the fraud perpetrated against the Morrison family are to be returned immediately." Leah's lawyer leaned over to whisper something to her, but she shook her head slightly. She was looking at me across the courtroom, her expression unreadable. "Mrs. Leah Morrison," Judge Hamilton said, "you will surrender all keys, access codes, and claims to the Morrison family home immediately. You are also enjoined from contacting any member of the Morrison family or interfering with their lives in any way. Violation of this order will result in immediate contempt charges." "Yes, Your Honor," Leah said quietly. As the judge concluded the proceedings and court was dismissed, I expected to feel triumphant. Instead, I felt something quieter, more profound. Peace. Sarah gathered her papers and smiled at me. "Congratulations, Vincent, you're going home." Outside the courthouse, Stanley and I stood on the steps together, neither of us quite ready to leave. The afternoon was warm, with the kind of golden light that makes everything look like a painting. "Dad," Stanley said finally, "I know I can't undo the past months. I can't take back the pain I caused you or the way I betrayed Mom's memory, but I want to try to make things right." I looked at my son, really looked at him, and saw the boy who used to help me in the garage, who used to fall asleep on my shoulder during long car rides. We both made mistakes, Stanley. What matters is what we do now. I've been thinking about that, he said, about what Mom would want us to do now. 3 days later, Stanley helped me move my belongings back into the house on Maple Street. It felt strange at first, walking through rooms that had been preserved like a museum while Leah had lived there. But gradually, as we unpacked boxes and rearranged furniture, it began to feel like home again. We found Margaret's wedding ring in Leah's jewelry box, along with several other pieces that were supposed to have been mine. Leah had been planning to sell them, according to the investigator's report. Looking at that simple gold band, I remembered the day I'd given it to Margaret, how her eyes had filled with tears, how she'd whispered that she'd love me forever. She'd kept that promise, even beyond death. That evening, Stanley and I sat on the back porch I'd built for Margaret, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. Margaret's roses were blooming again, the white Elizabeths she'd loved so much, thriving despite everything that had happened. "I've been thinking about selling my house," Stanley said suddenly. "It doesn't feel like home anymore, knowing what happened there." "Where would you go?" He was quiet for a moment. "I was wondering if you'd like some company here. I know it's a big house for one person, and I thought, maybe—" He trailed off, uncertain. I thought about the prospect of having my son close again, of sharing meals and conversations, of rebuilding the family that Leah had tried to destroy. "Your mother would like that," I said finally. "She always worried that you lived too far away." Stanley smiled for the first time in weeks. "She used to say this porch was her favorite place in the world. She'd sit out here with her coffee every morning watching the sun rise." "She said it helped her think," I remembered. "She'd plan her whole day out here, figure out problems, make decisions." "Maybe that's what we need to do," Stanley said. "Sit here and figure out how to move forward." The criminal trial took place that fall. Leah was sentenced to 7 years in prison for fraud, forgery, and elder abuse. The judge was particularly harsh, noting that she'd targeted some of society's most vulnerable members during their most desperate moments. During the sentencing hearing, 8 other families came forward to testify about how Leah had manipulated them during their loved ones' illnesses. The total amount of her fraud was over $200,000, stolen from people who were already facing the devastating costs of serious illness. I thought about attending the sentencing, but in the end I decided against it. Leah Morrison was no longer part of my story. She was a chapter that was closed, a wrong that had been righted. Stanley went, though. He said he needed to hear the judge's words, needed to see justice served for his mother. When he came home that evening, he looked older but somehow lighter, as if a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. "It's over," he said simply. That winter, Stanley moved into the upstairs bedroom that had once been his as a child. We established new routines: morning coffee on the porch when weather permitted, shared dinners, quiet evenings reading or watching television. It wasn't the same as having Margaret there, but it was good in its own way. On what would have been Margaret's 60th birthday, we visited her grave together. I brought white roses from the garden. Stanley brought a small framed photo of the 3 of us from happier times. Standing there in the quiet cemetery, I told Margaret about everything that had happened, about the trial and the victory and Stanley coming home. I told her I was sorry it had taken so long to uncover the truth. Sorry she'd had to endure Leah's manipulation during her final months. Stanley placed his hand on the headstone. "I'm sorry too, Mom," he said quietly. "I'm sorry I didn't protect you from her." As we walked back to the car, Stanley asked me something that had been weighing on my mind too. "Do you think Mom knew? At the end, do you think she understood what Leah was doing?" I thought about Margaret's final week, about that moment when she'd tried to tell me something about papers and signatures before Leah had interrupted. "I think she suspected something," I said. "I think she was trying to warn me, but she didn't have the strength to fight it." "But she fought in the end, didn't she?" Stanley said. "By making sure there was enough evidence for us to find the truth." I looked at my son, surprised by the insight. "What do you mean?" "The appointment card in her purse. The fact that she asked Dr. Roberts to document her cognitive issues after surgery. Even that moment you told me about when she tried to tell you about the papers. It's like she left us clues." I'd never thought about it that way, but Stanley was right. Even in her confusion and weakness, Margaret had been thinking ahead, leaving breadcrumbs for us to follow when we were ready to see them. 6 months after the trial ended, I made a decision that surprised even me. I established a foundation in Margaret's name, using the money we'd recovered from Leah's fraud. The Margaret Morrison Foundation provides support and advocacy for families dealing with serious illness, helping them navigate the medical system and avoid the kind of predatory schemes that had targeted us. Stanley helped me set it up, using his business skills to handle the legal and administrative details. It felt right turning our pain into something that could help others. Margaret would have approved. On a warm spring morning, almost 2 years after that devastating day in the lawyer's office, I sat on the back porch with my coffee, watching the sunrise paint the sky in soft pastels. Margaret's roses were blooming more beautifully than ever, and I could hear Stanley moving around in the kitchen, getting ready for another day at the foundation office. My phone rang, a call from Sarah Chen with an update about another case involving medical fraud. These calls came regularly now. Our victory had opened doors for other families fighting similar battles. As I ended the call and settled back into my chair, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: contentment. Not happiness exactly. Margaret's loss would always be a hollow place in my heart, but a sense of rightness, of purpose fulfilled. The house around me was full of memories, good and bad, but the bad ones were fading, overwhelmed by the knowledge that love had triumphed over greed, that truth had prevailed over lies, that family, real family, had endured. Margaret's wedding ring sat on the small table beside my chair, where I'd placed it every morning since moving back home. I picked it up and held it to the light, watching it catch the sunrise. "We did it, sweetheart," I whispered to the morning air. "We won." And for the first time since losing her, I felt like she was smiling back.